The grand ballroom of the Havisham estate shimmered under the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. It was a world of polished silver, delicate china, and the soft rustle of expensive fabric. At the center of it all, at a gleaming black grand piano, sat Leo Vance. His fingers danced across the keys, producing a cascade of perfect, icy notes for the small, privileged audience. He was not just playing. He was performing, his every movement calculated to convey the aura of a born genius. The masterclass was for the gifted children of the city's elite, but it was also a social event. Parents and patrons sat in gilded chairs, nodding appreciatively, seeing the performance as proof of their own good taste. The air smelled of perfume and ambition, not in the shadow of the arched service entrance. Partially hidden by a velvet curtain stood a young man. His name was Elias. He was the son of the housekeeper Maria, and his world was one of back staircases, the scent of lemon polish and quiet observation. His mother was busy today, ensuring the trays of canapes and glasses of sparkling water never ran empty. Elias helped, his movements quiet and efficient, but his eyes were always drawn to the piano dot as he moved through the room with a tray, refilling glasses. He would pause for a fraction of a second longer than necessary when close to the instrument. His ears, tuned to the music, caught every nuance. His left hand, holding the heavy tray, would tense slightly, his fingers pressing imaginary keys against its underside. He knew this piece. He had heard Leo Vance practice it through the closed doors of the music room for the past 3 days while he dusted the hallway. The formal playing ended, and Leo Vance turned to his students, his voice smooth and carrying. "Remember," he said, a faint, knowing smile on his lips, "technique can be drilled. But the soul of the music, the feeling, that is something you either have or you do not. It is a gift, innate and unteachable." A murmur of agreement rippled through the well-dressed crowd. It was a comforting idea for them. True artistry was a birthright, a proof of SPECILNESS. Elias, placing an empty glass on his tray by the back wall, felt a familiar, quiet heat in his chest. He had heard this kind of talk before. It was in the way some guests spoke to his mother, as if her kindness was simply part of her job, not a choice she made. It was in the assumption that because his hands were often busy with work, they could not understand beauty. He was not a confrontational person. His life was built on staying unnoticed, on doing his tasks well and retreating. But the music, and now these words, touched something deeper, a place where he kept his own private world. Before he could think, the words were out, clear but not loud, cutting through the polite atmosphere. "Respectfully, sir," Elias said. The room went very quiet. All heads turned to see the source of the voice, a young man in simple, clean clothes, holding a serving tray. Isn't the soul just a story waiting to be told? And stories aren't gifts. They're learned. By listening, even from the silence. A stifled giggle came from a student in the front row. Leo Vance's eyebrows rose, not in anger, but in amused disbelief. He looked Elias up and down, taking in his position, his role. A smile played on his lips, but it wasn't kind. "Well," Leo said, his voice dripping with theatrical curiosity, "we have a philosopher among us. And from such an interesting perspective." He gestured broadly to the room. "You speak of listening, of stories. This is a music masterclass. We deal in sound. So tell us your story. Let's hear what the silence has taught you." He waved a hand toward the magnificent piano. "Come, show us this innate feeling you believe can be learned." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. It was not an invitation. It was a trap, a public stage set for a fall. The audience tittered, a mix of excitement and embarrassment. They watched the scene unfold like a play, eager for the next line. Elias's mother, Maria, had frozen near the kitchen door, a pitcher of water in her hand. Her face was a mask of worry. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't," her eyes pleaded. "Just come back here." For a long moment, Elias stood perfectly still. The tray in his hands felt suddenly very heavy. He saw the expectant, mocking faces, the pianist's smug assurance, and his mother's fear. The safe thing, the smart thing, was to lower his head, mumble an apology, and disappear into the kitchen. He could almost feel the relief that would follow, the quick laughter that would dismiss him, and life would return to normal. But then he looked at the piano, not as a symbol of a world he couldn't enter, but as just an instrument, a tool for telling the story he carried inside, the one forged in the quiet hours of the night, listening to recordings on a cracked phone, practicing scales on a tabletop. The fear was still there, cold in his stomach, but beneath it was a stronger current, a deep, stubborn love for the very thing he was being dared to touch. Without a word, he walked to the sideboard, set his tray down with a soft clink, and turned. He did not look at the guests as he walked the long stretch of polished floor to the center of the room. The only sound was the whisper of his shoes on the wood and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He was walking not just toward a piano, but directly into the heart of their ridicule, carrying nothing but the silent music he had spent a lifetime collecting. A heavy quiet fell over the ballroom, broken only by the soft, shuffling sound of his shoes on the polished wood. It was a long walk from the sideboard to the center of the room. Every eye followed him. He could feel their looks like little pinpricks. On the back of his neck, a mix of curiosity, amusement, and a kind of hungry waiting for him to fail. The pianist, Leo, had not moved from his spot by the instrument. He leaned against it now, one elbow resting on the glossy lid, a faint, patient smile on his face. It was the look of someone watching a mildly interesting experiment. He gestured, with his other hand toward the piano bench, a slow, sweeping motion that said, "Asterisk, the stage is yours." Asterisk, the young man Elias reached the bench. Up close, the piano was even more imposing. It was a creature of deep, black shine and golden letters, a world away from the worn, silent keyboard he practiced on in the storage room at home. That one had sticky keys and no sound, but he knew the shape of its silence by heart. He paused for a moment, just looking at the keys. A whisper, sharp and clear, cut through the air from a woman in a blue dress. "This is rather awkward, isn't it?" Someone else gave a quiet, nervous laugh. He pulled the bench out. It was heavier than he expected. The legs scraped softly on the floor. He sat down. The leather of the bench was cool. His feet found the pedals. He placed his hands in his lap for a second, just breathing. They were not the soft, manicured hands of the students here. They were strong hands with traces of old scratches and calluses, from work from moving furniture with his mother, from fixing a leaky tap. But the fingers were long. "Take your time," Leo said, his voice smooth and loud enough for everyone to hear. "We are all very eager to learn from the silence." A few people smiled, covering their mouths with their hands. Elias did not look at him. He was not in the grand ballroom anymore. He was in a small, tidy room late at night, the only light from a small lamp. He was listening to a crackling recording on an old phone, the music tinny and distant, trying to copy the feeling of it in his mind. He was watching his mother's tired face soften as she heard him humming a tune. While washing dishes, he slowly lifted his hands. The room seemed to lean forward. In the very back, near the kitchen door, his mother stood perfectly still. She had one hand pressed flat against the wall, as if to hold herself up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked on her son. She wasn't seeing the crowd or the famous pianist. She was just seeing her boy, looking very small on that big bench. His fingers hovered just above the ivory keys. They trembled just slightly. He saw the tremor and closed his eyes for one deep breath. The noise of the room, the rustling, the whispers, the judgment faded away. All that was left was the map of the music in his head. It was a piece he had lived with for years, a friend in the quiet. He knew every turn, every climb, every fall. He opened his eyes. The first note dot, it was not a melody. It was a single deep sound. He pressed the key for the low A and let it ring. The note was full. It was not hit hard. It was placed into the room with a kind of solemn weight. It vibrated in the air, rich and pure, humming in the chests of everyone listening. It was a sound that demanded attention, not through volume, but through its perfect, resonant truth. It held on, and in its fading, it sucked every last bit of chatter and mockery out of the hall. The smile on Leo's face froze. It didn't vanish, but it changed. The casual amusement in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sharper focus. He straightened up just a little, his elbow coming off the piano lid, before the silence after that. First note could become uncomfortable. Before anyone could draw a breath to speak, Elias's hands moved. They came down onto the keys, and the room was filled with music. It was the powerful, sorrowful opening of Rachmaninoff. But it did not sound like practice. It did not sound like someone showing off. It sounded like a storm breaking open inside a heart. His body moved with the music, not with dramatic flourishes, but with the natural flow of someone pouring out a story he knew by soul. The powerful chords were deep and aching. The quieter passages were like secrets being whispered. You could hear the longing in it, a year's deep yearning that had lived quietly and was now, finally, given a voice. The guests in their fine clothes were motionless. The woman in the blue dress who had whispered earlier had her hand resting, forgotten, against her cheek. A man who had been checking his watch let his arm fall slowly to his side. They were not just hearing notes played correctly. They were hearing a feeling so raw and true, it was almost uncomfortable. They were hearing the sound of late nights and silent practice, of dreams nurtured in the dark. They were hearing the soul of the boy they had just been pitying and laughing at. Leo Vance was no longer leaning. He stood upright, his arms now folded tightly across his chest. All the relaxed superiority was gone. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was a master of his craft, and he recognized something instantly. This was not just talent. This was understanding. This was a connection to the music that went beyond technique, something warm and human and powerful that his own perfect, icy performance had lacked. He watched the boy's hands, the confident, sure movement of those working-class fingers, and a slow, dawning shock settled in his stomach. He had not brought a joker onto the stage. He had uncovered a musician. The music didn't just stop the noise in the room. It changed the very air. That single, perfect note had been a key turning in a lock. Now the door was open, and a river of sound poured out. His hands, those familiar hands that carried trays and pushed brooms, were now in command of something magnificent. They moved across the keyboard, not with frantic energy, but with a sure, deep knowing. The opening chords of the piece were heavy with emotion, a beautiful sadness that filled the huge room and touched every person in it. You could hear more than just piano notes. You could hear the story of long, quiet evenings. You could hear the patience of years. The guests were frozen. A woman who had been adjusting a diamond bracelet let her hand drop into her lap, forgotten. A man with a stern face felt his sternness melt away without him even deciding to. They had come to see a polished performance, a display of skill. This was not that. This was something being revealed, something raw and true being pulled up from a deep, hidden place. The joke was over. The embarrassment they had expected to feel for him was gone. replaced by a different kind of heat, the warmth of being in the presence of real, undeniable feeling. At the back of the room, his mother, Maria, let the breath she'd been holding shudder out of her. The tight knot of fear in her chest didn't vanish, but it loosened, unraveling into threads of awe. Her eyes, which had been squeezed with worry, now swam with tears. She saw her son, but she saw the ghost of a little boy, too. She saw him at 7, tapping out a rhythm on the kitchen table. She saw him at 12, saving his tiny earnings from helping neighbors for months to buy a pair of second-hand headphones, just so he could listen to classical music while he did his homework. The sound filling the ballroom was the sound of all those silent years given a voice. One tear escaped, tracing a clean line down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Leo Vance, the celebrated pianist, felt the ground shift under his feet. The amused detachment was gone, shattered by that very first chord. His trained ear heard the technique. It was solid, even exceptional for someone with no formal training. But it was the music behind the notes that gripped him. This boy wasn't playing the Rachmaninoff he knew from concerts and recordings. He was playing a different piece, entirely one of longing, of practice in the dark, of a love so pure it had been polished by silence. Leo's own performances were like magnificent ice sculptures, beautiful, precise, and cold. This was a living fire. He uncrossed his arms, letting them hang at his sides. His professional pride, which had felt so solid moments ago, now felt thin and fragile. He watched the boy's back, the slight curve of his shoulders as he leaned into a passionate phrase. He saw the absolute focus, the complete absence of any awareness of the crowd. This was not a performance for them. This was something personal, and they were just allowed to listen in. Elias himself was far away. The grand ballroom, the chandeliers, the watching eyes, they had all dissolved. He was inside the music. His fingers found the keys by a memory that lived in his muscles and bones. The piano was no longer a stranger, a symbol of a world that wasn't his. It was just an instrument, and finally, after all this time, he was speaking its language fully. He felt the vibration of the strings through the keys, up his arms, into his core. He wasn't thinking about right or wrong notes. He was feeling the rise and fall of the melody, the places where it hurt and the places where it soared. This piece had been his companion during lonely times, his secret world. Now he was letting that world out, and it felt like taking a deep, true breath for the first time. As the music swelled, building to a powerful climax before dipping into a softer, more tender section, something happened in the audience. A few people exchanged glances, not of gossip, but of shared wonder. They had come to see one kind of mastery, and they were witnessing another. The divisions in the room between the guests on the chairs and the staff in the doorway, between the maestro and the novice, were blurring, washed away by the shared experience of the music. A young student, the one who had giggled earlier, was staring with her mouth slightly open. Her own fingers twitched in her lap, mimicking the movements she saw, a slow dawning of respect in her eyes. Leo Vance took a small, almost unconscious step forward, then another. He moved quietly, not wanting to break the spell, until he was standing just to the side of the piano, where he could see Elias's profile. He saw the faint line of concentration between his brows, the slight tightening of his jaw during a difficult passage, the soft release of his breath when the music resolved into something beautiful. He was looking at the face of an artist. Not a student, not a prodigy, but an artist. The truth of it was a humbling, quiet blow. He thought of his own words, spoken with such certainty just minutes before. Asterisk, it is a gift, innate and unteachable. The arrogance of it now rang in his ears, hollow and foolish. This boy had been taught by the silence. He had been taught by need, by love, by listening through closed doors. His gift hadn't been handed to him. It had been built Note by silent note, in the shadows, the music moved towards its final powerful section. Elias's body gathered itself, his shoulders squaring. He was nearing the end of his story. In the resonant silence between the crashing chords, you could have heard a pin drop on the soft carpet. No one coughed. No one shifted. They were all holding on, waiting for the last note, for the final piece of this astonishing truth to fall into place. The music was building, climbing a great hill of sound. Elias's hands were a blur of motion, but every movement had a purpose. The powerful chords rang through the ballroom, vibrating in the crystal of the chandeliers and in the chests of the people listening. This was no longer just a piece by Rachmaninoff. It was a storm of feeling, all the quiet hours, the secret dreams, the unspoken love for something beautiful, all crashing together into a magnificent wave of sound. He played the final, thundering passages with a strength that seemed impossible for his slender frame. It wasn't the strength of muscles, but of spirit. And then, as quickly as the storm had risen, it broke. The music softened, becoming a series of gentle falling notes, like rain after thunder. They were clear and pure, each one a drop of light. They spoke of peace, of a struggle that was over, of a truth finally told. The last note was a single, high, shimmering tone. He held the pedal down, letting it sing in the quiet air. It hung there, fragile and perfect, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he lifted his fingers from the keys. The sound faded into a silence that was deeper and more complete than any that had come before. For a long moment, nothing happened. No one clapped. No one moved. The audience sat as if carved from stone, their eyes wide, still caught in the world the music had built around them. The spell was so strong that breaking it felt wrong. An older gentleman near the front slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with a clean handkerchief. He didn't look embarrassed. He just looked moved. Elias sat at the piano, his head bowed slightly, his hands resting softly in his lap. He felt empty, but in a good way, like he had finally put down a heavy weight he'd been carrying for years. The roar of his own heart in his ears was slowing. He became aware again of the room, of the people, of the soft fabric of the bench beneath him. Then, a single sound broke the quiet. Clap. It was one solitary clap from the back of the room. It was his mother. She had stepped out from the doorway, her hands coming together once, sharp and clear. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling a smile so full of pride it seemed to light her up from within. That one clap was like a signal. It broke the stillness. Another person joined in. Then another. It wasn't the polite, measured applause that had followed Leo Vance's performance. This was different. It started slow, almost hesitant, as if people were waking up. Then it grew, swelling into a wave of genuine, heartfelt sound. People rose to their feet. They weren't just applauding. They were giving a standing ovation, their faces filled with awe and a kind of shaken respect. The young student who had giggled was clapping so hard her hands were red. The woman in the blue dress was nodding, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of deep thought. The entire atmosphere in the room had been turned upside down. Through it all, Leo Vance stood rooted to his spot beside the piano. The applause washed around him, but he seemed to barely hear it. He was looking only at Elias. The shock on his face had softened into something more complex, a mix of professional respect, deep curiosity, and a humbling dose of shame. As the applause began to calm, Elias finally stood up from the bench. He turned to face the room, and for the first time since he'd sat down, he looked at the crowd. He didn't smile a triumphant smile. He simply gave a small, humble bow of his head. Then his eyes found his mother's in the back. To her, he gave a deeper, more personal nod. It was a silent thank you. For everything, he stepped away from the piano intending to walk back to the sideboard, back to his place. But Leo Vance moved. He put out a hand, not to stop him, but to gesture for him to wait. The room fell quiet again, eager to hear what the maestro would say. Would he be angry? Would he try to take back the moment? Leo looked at the young man before him. He saw the calm in his eyes, the lack of gloating or pride. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his famous, smooth voice was gone. It was quieter, rougher. That. He began, then stopped. He tried again. What you just did. That was not playing. He paused, searching for the right words. The whole room leaned in. That was speaking, Leo said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. You spoke with the piano. I have performed that piece 100 times. I know every note, but you showed me I did not know the heart of it. He took a step closer, his expression intense, but no longer cold. Where did you learn? Who taught you? Elias met his gaze. The room was so silent you could hear the rustle of a curtain from an open window. He thought of the silent keyboard, the crackling recordings, the closed doors. No one taught me, sir, he said, his voice clear and steady in the hushed room. And everyone did. The music itself, if you listen long enough, it teaches you. My teacher was wanting to hear it better. My practice was finding a way to hear it when everything was quiet. He glanced toward the service entrance, toward the world of work and simple things. Sometimes, he added softly, you listen hardest when you're not supposed to be listening at all. A murmur of understanding rippled through the audience. It wasn't a fancy answer. It was a true one. Leo Vance stared at him. He slowly nodded, as if accepting a difficult but important lesson. Then he did something no one expected. The great pianist turned to face the audience still on their feet. Today, he announced, his voice now filled with a new gravity, I did not give a master class. He turned and pointed a finger, not in accusation, but in acknowledgement, at Elias. I received one. He then looked at Elias again, and his tone became direct, urgent. You will waste this gift no longer. You will study, properly. You have things to say that the world needs to hear. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes scanning the wealthy, influential faces. And I believe there are people here who will make sure that happens. His gaze landed on an older couple near the front. The man was a well-known patron of the arts, a man who had funded concert halls and scholarships. The patron held Leo's gaze, then looked at Elias. He gave a single firm nod. In that moment, everything changed. The path of Elias's life, which had always been a narrow, hidden trail, suddenly widened into a road he had never dared to dream existed. And it all started because he had dared to speak back to the silence, and then finally to break it. The applause had died down, but the feeling in the room had not. It was a thick, buzzing energy, a mixture of shock, admiration, and the quiet hum of people who knew they had witnessed something they would talk about for years. The neat order of the masterclass was gone, replaced by something more real and messy. Elias stood there, feeling the heat of all those eyes on him. It was different now. Before, their looks had been like sharp little stones. Now they were warm, like sunlight, but it was still overwhelming. He just wanted to go back to the kitchen, to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the smell of soap, where things made sense. He gave one last small nod to the room, then turned to walk away. But the world had other plans. People moved toward him. Not in a crowd, but one by one, like cautious explorers approaching something rare. The first was the elderly arts patron, the man who had nodded. He had a kind face, etched with lines, and his eyes were bright with interest. Young man, he said, his voice low and gravelly. What is your name? Elias, sir. Elias, the patron repeated, as if tasting the word. What you did, that was not entertainment. That was a communication. He glanced at Leo Vance, who was standing a few feet back, watching quietly. Maestro Vance is correct. A gift like that is a responsibility. It must be trained not to change it, but to give it the tools to grow stronger. He pulled a simple card from his jacket pocket. My foundation assists young musicians. I would like you and your mother to come and see me this week. We will talk. Elias took the card, the thick paper feeling strange in his work-roughened fingers. Thank you, sir, but I have no money for lessons. The patron waved a hand, a gentle dismissal of such a worry. That is not your concern. Your concern is the music. Let others handle the rest. Before Elias could even process this, a woman, one of the piano students' mothers, approached. Her eyes were red-rimmed. My son has been taking lessons for 10 years, she said quietly, almost to herself. He practices every day, but he has never made anyone feel what you just made us feel. She didn't seem sad about it. She seemed enlightened. You have reminded us all what the point of it is. Thank you. Others came, not to gawk, but to offer a handshake, a soft word of praise. They asked where he had learned, and he gave the same simple answers. By listening, on a silent keyboard. Their faces showed they didn't fully understand, but they respected the mystery of it. Through it all, his mother had made her way through the crowd. She didn't push. People simply parted for her, sensing who she was. When she reached him, she didn't say a word. She just put her hands on his shoulders, looked into his eyes, and pulled him into a tight, fierce hug. He could feel her crying silently against his shoulder. He hugged her back, the sounds of the room fading away. This was the only approval that truly mattered. Across the room, Leo Vance was also surrounded, but by people asking him questions. Did you know? Is he a prodigy? Leo answered them briefly, his eyes still following Elias. Finally, he excused himself and walked over. The chatter nearby died down as the two pianists, the established master and the boy from the shadows, stood, facing each other again. The challenge was gone. In its place was a new, delicate space. Elias, Leo began. He sounded tired, but in a good way, like after hard, honest work. I owe you an apology. My earlier words, they were small. You showed me something large today. Elias shook his head. No apology needed, sir. You gave me the chance to play, even if that wasn't your plan. A faint, real smile touched Leo's lips. No, it wasn't. He sighed. I have spent my life in concert halls, worried about reviews and perfect technique. You play from a place I had forgotten. A place of pure need. He looked at the grand piano, then back at Elias. I would like to help. Not as your master, but as your first guide. Introduce you to teachers who won't break your spirit, just shape it, if you want. Elias looked at his mother. Her eyes were wide, but she gave a slow, sure nod. He turned back to Leo. I would like that. Very much. Good, Leo said. He looked like a weight had lifted. Then we start tomorrow. No more silent keyboards. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The news, of course, did not stay in the ballroom. It flowed through the house, among the staff. The cook heard it from a waiter and put down her ladle, her mouth open in shock. The gardener, trimming hedges outside the open window, had heard the music and the applause. He gave a gap-toothed grin and a thumbs up to Elias as he passed by later. That evening, in their small, tidy apartment above the garage, everything was the same, but everything was different. The familiar couch, the small table, the picture of a seaside on the wall, they were all there. But the air crackled with a new future. His mother made his favorite simple meal, but her hands were still shaking a little. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable, dazed silence. "All those times," she said finally, her voice soft. "I heard you tapping. In your room. On the table. I thought it was just a habit. A sheet-eat boy with a quiet habit. It was my way of singing," he said. She reached over and covered his hand with hers. "I heard you sing today. The whole world heard you." Later, as he lay in bed, the events replayed in his mind. Not the applause, not the offers. He thought of the moment his finger pressed that first key. The solid feel of it. The sound blooming in the quiet. That was the moment the door opened. Everything else just walked through after Dot down the hall. His mother sat at the kitchen table, the patron's business card in front of her. She wasn't thinking about fame or concerts. She was thinking of practical things. Better shoes for his growing feet. A real piano, even a small one, in the living room. The look on his face when he could play whenever he wanted, not just in stolen, silent moments. She smiled a small, private smile. Her boy, the one who always listened, who always noticed. He had turned his noticing into something so beautiful, it had stopped the hearts of a room full of strangers. Her maid's son. Her genius boy. Outside, the moon was bright. In the big house, the grand piano sat silent in the dark ballroom, holding the memory of the music in its strings. Its story, and the story of the boy who played it, was just beginning. And it started not with a concert, but with a challenge. Not with a teacher, but with silence. And it would continue not because he was born for greatness, but because he had loved something enough to learn its language in the dark, and was finally, bravely, speaking it in the light.